Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another session which the Observatorio de la Lengua Española y las Culturas Hispánicas en Estados Unidos organizes in collaboration with Dr. Maria Luisa Parra from the Department of Romance, Languages and Literatures at Harvard University as part of her lecture series within, quotes, RLL's initiative on teaching Spanish as a heritage language. This is a project coordinated by Dr. Parra in her department and co-sponsored by this research center of the Instituto Cervantes at Harvard University. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank Maria Luisa very sincerely for her fruitful and efficient collaboration with us, which has enabled the Observatorio to host a great variety of seminars, workshops, lectures on heritage language speakers and topics relating to the teaching of Spanish, which have been extremely successful. Maria Luisa has always suggested really interesting and cutting-edge topics, such as the topic of today's session. And she has also always suggested brilliant speakers like today's guest speaker, Dr. Ellen Serafini, who will be introduced by Dr. Parra in a minute. Let me just inform you that, as usual, this event is being recorded and that after Dr. Serafini's talk, there'll be a Q&A part where you will all be able to ask your questions, make comments through the chat on the Zoom platform, and you may do so either in English or in writing, in whichever language you may wish to do it. So I leave you with Dr. Parra and Dr. Serafini. I hoping you will enjoy this talk. I'm sure you will. So welcome, Ellen. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. And thank you so much again, Maria Luisa. The floor is yours now.
Thank you, Marta.
Thank you. Muchísimas gracias, Marta. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you for the Observatorio for co-sponsoring one more time. One fabulous speaker, a rising star. And it's a pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Ellen Serafini. She's an associate professor at George Mason University. She has a Ph.D. and a master's degree in Spanish Applied Linguistics from Georgetown University and a master's in Hispanic Linguistics from the University of Arizona. Dr. Serafini has been doing extensive research in very important areas, and her research and approach to teaching are informed by principles of critical language pedagogy, service learning, task-based language teaching, and as we will see today, also linguistic landscapes. Her work has appeared in several edited volumes and academic journals, very important ones such as the Modern Language Journal, Hispania, International Journal of Bilingual Education and Bilingualism, and Language and Teaching. And she is currently co-editor of the forthcoming book, Manual para la Formación de Profesores de Español. I have to say that I had the pleasure to be co-author with her in our most recent articles about el lenguaje inclusivo, Bienvenidos Todes, that has been published in the Journal of Spanish Language Teaching, and that allowed me to know her work better and how she, is developing her work around topics of service learning in heritage language education, assessment, very important, as I said, task-based, and also starting to look into equity in mixed classes with heritage and L2 students, as well as the importance of home and language support in two-way immersion programs. So it's a pleasure to have you here, Ellen, and we open the floor for you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, María Luisa. Muchísimas gracias, María Luisa, y a todo el equipo, Marta, Victoria y Joseph. Esta fue una introducción demasiado generosa. Es un verdadero honor tener la oportunidad de participar en esta serie de ponencias organizada por el Observatorio y la Facultad de Lenguas y Literaturas Romances en Harvard. So estoy súper feliz de estar aquí. And of course, I wanted to sincerely thank all of you for being here today, taking the time to join today. And I'm excited to talk about linguistic landscape and hopefully hear from you how you've used it in your own research and teaching contexts. Sorry, Joseph, could you go to the first slide? I think that's a few slides in. My apologies. There we go. Oh, yeah, thank you so much. So what I'm going to talk about is how I've used linguistic landscape in a Spanish community-based heritage setting, or really a mixed setting with both heritage and second language Spanish students enrolled. And I will focus on how I've used it not only as a pedagogical tool to promote critical learning objectives, which we'll talk about what that means, but also as a form of assessment in measuring the development of critical language awareness as a learning outcome. Okay, Jess, you can go to the next one. So I'm really hoping this talk will contribute something valuable to the ongoing conversations that I'm sure we're all aware are happening at multiple levels in Facebook groups via this wonderful lecture series organized by Dr. Parra. And I think what these conversations reveal is that we belong to a growing community as scholars and educators who are constantly trying to develop, seek out, and reflect on what does best practices mean in the context of teaching students of Spanish as a heritage language in the US. So I think the topic of linguistic landscape really aligns well with the first objective of this series, of this initiative as a whole, and I hope to show how it can provide critical educators with a tool for promoting heritage students' agency in particular, which we will see as a key component of developing a critical awareness of language. So next slide, please. Here's a quick snapshot just to give you a preview of what I'm going to talk about today. I first want to get a lay of the land, so to speak, of the burgeoning field known as linguistic landscape, how it's used as a research method in different settings across the world, and then more recently, how it is used in language learning and teaching contexts. And of course, we'll focus on linguistic landscape as it is carried out in contexts where Spanish is spoken, particularly the US. Then I want to hone in on what I mean by critical linguistic landscape, what that means in practice. And to do that, we need to talk a little bit about what critical language awareness means, what it is as a construct and as an objective of pedagogy. And I'm going to highlight some work in this area conducted in a community-based Spanish heritage setting, which is similar to my own, my own context that I'll be telling you about today. Yes, okay, so then I'm going to give you more details, probably more than you want, about this upper level community-based Spanish for Specific Purposes course titled Spanish for Social Services. And I developed this as part of a curriculum impact grant that I'll talk a little bit more about later. But I did want to note that I offered this course in the spring of 2020, which I'm sure we will all forever remember as the COVID-19 semester, with a before March 13th and an after March 13th. So I'll talk a little bit about what that meant in terms of changing the linguistic landscape, the nature of the linguistic landscape project, which I had originally envisioned being carried out in the physical local community and local healthcare and social service agencies, but that was quickly changed. So I will use my favorite word from the pandemic, which is pivot, right? We all had to learn how to pivot and change our plans. So as an educator, I will illustrate how I did that during the global pandemic. And to close, I'll share. So I'll first share in detail how I applied linguistic landscape methods to this context. And then I want to share concrete examples of CLA from my students' final linguistic landscape projects. And by that point, you'll probably be tired of me speaking, so I'll just highlight some key takeaways and consider implications for future directions, and then look forward to talking more about these topics with you all. Okay, so I'm going to start with a poll. And perhaps by now you are all sick of polls, but before we just dive in, I want to briefly get a sense of your experience or familiarity with linguistic landscape. So thank you, Joseph, for sharing that. If everyone could just answer out of those 4 response options, whether you've ever used linguistic landscape or not, and to what extent, either in research or teaching. Okay, I see. Awesome. Okay, so it seems like a majority so far has at least used it somewhat frequently in research and or teaching, and 35% have never used it in research or teaching. So thank you. And 10% of you have extensively used it. So you could be giving this talk. So thank you so much for participating. That really helps me get a feel for the audience. And it's obvious that many of you are quite familiar with linguistic landscape. But first, I just want to consider briefly how the concept originally emerged and then how it has evolved across contexts. So next slide, Joseph. Thank you. So this is sort of the starting definition point that many people refer to when talking about linguistic landscape. You probably know that this definition comes from Landry and Borges' seminal study, who defined it in terms of the visual display of language or languages in public spaces, specifically the language of public road signs, advertising billboards, street names, place names, commercial shop signs, public signs on buildings within a particular territory, region, or urban agglomeration. And Landry and Borges said that this physical public display of languages serves 2 basic functions: an informative function that communicates some sort of information that is useful to its viewers, such as what type of services are provided by a certain business. And then the visibility or non-visibility of a language can also be informative in terms of marking political or geographic boundaries of a region or a group. Importantly, the absence or presence of a language on public signs in the public space can also play a symbolic role in that it not only has a physical reality, but it can also have a psychological impact for ethno-linguistic groups that speak the minority language or minority languages, and impact their sense of belonging to the community. And this contributes to the perception or construction of social value that a certain language has within society, which can have positive or negative consequences, either contributing to patterns of language shift over time or strengthening the potential for language maintenance. Okay, Joseph. Here are just 2 examples from Betty, 2018, who used photography to analyze the urban linguistic landscape of several large US cities with the dominant Hispanic presence, like San Antonio, Texas. The first image is of a notice posted by the Archdiocese of San Antonio and is written in both Spanish and English, as you can see there. It serves an informative function, so clearly communicates no guns are allowed on the premises, but it also omits the phrase from Spanish, "Blessed are the peacemakers," so it's only provided in English. So the question is, perhaps that could be asked, is how the viewers of this sign interpret this exclusion, and what psychological impact does that have in terms of symbolically constructing the social status of Spanish in this space. The second image shows La Chiquita Bakery, which Betty describes as one of the best known bakeries in San Antonio with Mexican roots. It's hard to see, but the name of the bakery is displayed as both La Chiquita Bakery on the sidewall, mixing Spanish and English, but it's also above the entrance door in Spanish, Panadería La Chiquita. There's also a colorful mural on the sidewall with the text "Familia y Cultura es Vida." So Betty interprets these visual displays of language use as reflective of both the demographic characteristics of the neighborhood and their language practices, and also as a symbolic representation of the community's Hispanic cultural roots, and also the value of Spanish in that space. So can you go to the next slide, please? Thanks, Joseph. So, you know, in thinking about the informative function, the symbolic function of what the linguistic landscape can tell us about a particular place or about a particular community, you know, we have seen it says something about who lives there, its demographic characteristics. It reflects the history and the culture of a place and a community. And it also reveals how the government can impact language status through laws, right, that regulate the use of languages in the public sphere. And importantly, in multilingual settings where multiple languages coexist, Landry and Borges have also recognized it as, and can you go to the next or press the button, the most observable and immediate index of the relative power and status of a linguistic community, and an important sociolinguistic factor contributing to the vitality of competing ethno-linguistic groups. So you can think of ethno-linguistic vitality as the factors, the sociostructural factors that affect a group's ability to behave and survive as a distinct and active collective entity within multilingual settings. So essentially the opposite of ethno-linguistic vitality might be linguistic and cultural assimilation. And whereas an inclusion and a high prevalence and visibility of language is associated with a strong ethno-linguistic vitality, the exclusion or absence and low visibility of a language might indicate low vitality. Okay, Joseph. Thank you. So this focus on the relative power of languages and groups has led to more critical conceptions and approaches to the linguistic landscape over time. One that emphasizes it as a site of contested space and struggle. And as Lehman and Modin, I believe the amazing Jennifer Lehman is here. Hello. It is not, so it is not only an objective representation of the physical environment, but it can be conceived in terms of an ideological, subjective representation of space. So scholars have used linguistic landscape as a method in investigating the delegitimization of speakers, analyzing underlying language ideologies related to nationalism, for example, and also constructions of national identity, and how the linguistic landscape can perpetuate social inequality through a lack of language access for minoritized groups. Can you go to the next slide, please? Okay. So these questions have been looked at in linguistic landscapes all over the world, especially in bilingual and multilingual settings where multiple languages coexist or where there's particular political conflict. And, you know, the list goes on from Israel to Russia, Ukraine, you know, Bangladesh, Ethiopia, Ireland, the Czech Republic, Canada. The list goes on. It is a burgeoning field, as I said. And in the Spanish-speaking world, linguistic landscape has seen tremendous growth in the last 15 years or so. Joseph, can you? Thank you. With a very rich and constantly growing body of work in Spain, particularly in the Basque Country, led by Senos, Gorder, and colleagues. And we're seeing more and more linguistic landscape studies come out from that are carried out in different parts of the US and more recently in Latin America as well. Can you go to the next slide? Oh, wait, sorry, the one before this one. There we go. Thanks. The evidence, so within the context of the Spanish-speaking world, the evidence of this growth is pretty clear in this list of studies. It's not totally exhaustive, but you know, when I got on a roll, I tried to look up every single one, and I can't wait to read every single one. But just this list is really impressive, of studies conducted in different regions of Spain, Latin America, and the US, mainly in large urban contexts, but also recently in more mid-sized cities and even small towns. And there are now at least 3 articles in a book that provide overviews of the linguistic landscape research that has been conducted in the Spanish-speaking world that you see here on the bottom of the slide. And I do believe next Thursday at the National Symposium on Spanish as a Heritage Language, Maria Cecilia Colombi will give a plenary keynote titled Hablamos Español o Spanglish, el paisaje multilingüe de California. So I'm super excited to attend that. I think it will be very interesting and a great contribution to the US based research on linguistic landscape. Can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So a key difference to keep in mind here between these contexts, of course, and one that factors into the linguistic landscape is the socio-political status of Spanish. Whereas in Spain and Latin America, Spanish is the official language or one of the official languages of government and schooling, and generally a language of prestige spoken by a majority of inhabitants. In the US, it's one of many minority languages, albeit unique in many ways, given that it is, reportedly spoken by at least 41 million people at home, although those official statistics are problematic, as Lehman and Fuller discuss. So that makes it a majority minority language with deep historical ties to the US, particularly in the Southwest. And also don't forget that English is not the official language in the US. There's no official language established by the federal Constitution, although several states, including the Commonwealth of Virginia, have declared it with officials as an official language, the official language. So Joseph, can you go to yeah, thank you. In spite of all these factors that support a relatively high ethno-linguistic vitality, the status of Spanish and levels of bilingualism vary greatly by state and by region. And in part, this can be linked to ideologies and textbooks and media discourse that perpetually construct Spanish and Spanish speakers as foreign, and even portray Spanish and its speakers as a threat to national identity, which all contribute to patterns of intergenerational language shift and loss, and in some regions of the US lead to a more, what we would call minoritized status. But as we know in other regions like Miami, Spanish has high levels of prestige, and bilingualism is the norm in Spanish and English, not the exception. So all of these dynamics make the US an interesting context in which to analyze relationships between language and power in the linguistic landscape. Next slide, please. Thank you. And so what we've seen up until now is how linguistic landscape can be used as a research method, but I want to talk about how it can be used. Now I want to talk about how it can be used in the classroom with both heritage and second language students, and especially highlight its potential to serve as a tool for promoting learners' critical language awareness. So first, I just want to recognize the significant amount of pedagogical resources that now exist for educators, language educators, who want to use linguistic landscape to promote language learning, right? This can be done in a variety of ways. And as Senos and Gorder, highly recommend their work, discuss at length, we can bring real language use into the classroom through the data that linguistic landscape provides. The signs, the photographs, the visual and textual material can all serve as valuable sources of authentic input, right, which we are always seeking. It can provide exposure to new vocabulary used in context. It can help develop pragmatic abilities and awareness related to speech acts. It can raise learners' metalinguistic awareness of languages, as well as raise their awareness about multilingualism in a given context, including the use of translanguaging and its functions. Learners can also analyze the visibility of language in different ways. So Senos and Gorder discuss having learners calculate the percentage of languages used across a given sample of signage, or noting differences just in the placement of on bilingual signs. Where do the languages appear, and also what is the size and color of the font and the text used to communicate information in those languages, and then to use those data to interpret how the linguistic landscape reflects and reproduces linguistic and social hierarchies. And in the context of the Basque Country, they provide examples of how signs can be used to revitalize and maintain minority languages like Basque through language policy and planning efforts. Can you go to the next slide? Thank you. So they provide this sign as an example that they've used in their, or documented through their research. And this was displayed on a wall of a fish stall, and was part of a campaign to promote the use of the Basque language. And you can see the logo in the bottom right of the Basque language department of the city council. And the title means taste in Basque, as you all probably know, and it's displayed in both Spanish and Basque. And then the sign displays a bilingual list of several types of delicious fish and seafood. So this sign can, they talk about how they can use this sign in the classroom to not only raise learners' awareness about the importance of using Basque, but also as an opportunity to learn specialized terminology. Okay, next slide, please. So I think these examples we've seen of language learning really highlight its potential to not only promote awareness of the linguistic aspects of language, but also to promote and build learners' critical awareness of the social dimensions of language use. And what I mean by that, in a very simply but efficiently put definition, what is a critical awareness of language? Can you, the next slide, is essentially the understanding of how language is imbued with social meaning and power relations. And critical language awareness in this sense has become a core goal of pedagogy in the context of Spanish heritage language education in the US. And this is a field that emerged out of early work by Guadalupe Valdez that, critically first recognized that Spanish heritage learners and their needs were not being met in Spanish second or foreign language classrooms. And over the years, our notions of what CLA means, and by CLA, I mean critical language awareness. I'll use CLA for the rest of the talk. And what that means in both theory and practice has evolved over time, but I just want to note some core components, starting with the roots of CLA as a liberatory practice. Can you push? Thank you. A process of coming to critical social consciousness, or concientização, as conceived by Paulo Freire. This entails a critical understanding of the concept of appropriateness and being able to analyze, or if they choose, resist hegemonic, taken for granted conventions and norms that are established by dominant social groups and who determine what is appropriate in high status, public, prestigious contexts. And then CLA also means understanding key sociolinguistic concepts like that are related to language contact, variation and change, as well as the relationships between language and identity. And also a key point is, a main goal of CLA that has evolved within the context of US Spanish heritage education is the objective of empowering students to build their own agency and to enact it. And this is defined as a socio-culturally mediated capacity to act. And so agency in this sense can be enacted in terms of resisting and challenging language-based discrimination and linguistic and social hierarchies if if students choose to do so and desire to do so. So a key goal of CLA is to promote learners' choice, informed choice about their own language use. Next. Thank you. So this leads us to, before I talk about the course and how I use linguistic landscape, I wanted to talk about a study by Glenn Martinez, whose work I take great inspiration from. I mean, who doesn't? And this study is actually the only example I know of that implements linguistic landscape methods that are explicitly critical in nature, and that was carried out in a community-based healthcare setting with Spanish heritage speakers. So that is very relevant to my own pedagogical context that I'll be discussing. And the goals of this study, as you can see, are critical in nature, in aiming to develop a critical awareness and knowledge about the public display of language in healthcare environments. And to achieve this, Martinez took an innovative approach using participatory action research, specifically through something called photo voice methodology. And so I think 32 Spanish-speaking students acted as language investigators, and they constructed the linguistic landscape by taking photos in various healthcare organizations in Texas on the US-Mexico border, and they recorded their reflections of their observed language use. And what their photo voice projects and testimonies revealed was that not only was the use of English more prevalent than Spanish, can you press? Thank you. But also different types of discourse were relayed in each language. So there was the languages were Spanish and English was used to relay different types of discourse. So for example, promotional discourse, regulatory discourse, informative discourse. And then a key finding was that many of the signs that the students found and took pictures of were sort of makeshift in nature and with frequent errors and somewhat poor translations. So Martinez interpreted his students' findings as reflective of the linguistic inequality that was being enacted through the linguistic landscape in these healthcare spaces, which effectively created spaces of privilege for English and spaces of disadvantage for Spanish. Next slide. All right, finally, taking all of this into account, I'll share how I implemented critical linguistic landscape in my own context. I promised I would get here. I think I'm doing well on time, which is a miracle. So to briefly give a little bit of background, the course that I designed came out of a 2-year curriculum impact grant that I mentioned earlier. And this involved collaboration among Spanish, social work, and nursing faculty, colleagues. And our goal was to develop, we weren't sure at first what it was going to develop into, but our goal was to find innovative ways to create curriculum that would serve students majoring or minoring in Spanish, social service majors, healthcare related fields, and give them the opportunity to build linguistic and cultural competence and raise their critical awareness of the link between language access and social equity and how that plays out in their local communities. So the culmination of this work led to the design of a digital micro-credential badge that we now offer at 3 levels that you can see here. And if you'll go to the next slide, you can see I'm just briefly going to share, this is the description and aims of the most advanced badge. And you can read the description of the goals for learners who acquire this badge or earn this badge. And then on the next slide, you'll see quickly the earning criteria for the badge, what a student has to do to earn it. And one of the criteria is to take at least one relevant upper level Spanish course, and as well as one upper level course in a related field like community health or public health or nursing. So that is where my course comes in. Thank you. Spanish for social services. So I designed this as part of the grant, and we also offer a 400 level Spanish for healthcare community-based course as part of this initiative. So this course is focused on topics related to, the social determinants of health, the role of language and language access in health disparities and inequities in the US healthcare system. And also it aimed obviously to build students' linguistic and cultural competence and critical language awareness as potential future healthcare and social service providers. There were 13 students enrolled. You can go to the next. Thank you. As is typical of all of our upper level courses, Spanish courses at Mason, about half identified as Spanish heritage speakers and half identified as second language speakers of Spanish. Almost all were majoring or minoring in Spanish, and we're also pursuing a range of related degrees, many of which you can see were relevant to the course. Here's just a quick flash of some of the course readings and materials. I also wanted to say I'm happy to pass the syllabus, any of the materials related to this course to anyone interested. But you can see here some of the main readings that learners read throughout the course. And then, of course, I incorporated lots of other sources, especially related to the national standards for culturally and linguistically appropriate services in health and healthcare, called the National CLAS Standards. So students analyzed those. They engaged in a webinar led by the Office of Minority Health, and read, briefs about language and health by Rachel Shostak and colleagues. And then we analyzed the Twitter account of the Office of Minority Health as well. And we also read articles related, especially once we pivoted to the COVID-19 portion of the semester, I had them read articles related to access or unequal access to information for Spanish speakers related to COVID-19. So that's just an example of some of the materials from the course. And then the core course components were structured around tasks. I talk about tasks a lot. A discourse analysis of authentic interaction in a healthcare setting between patients, providers, and interpreters. They also carried out a role play between parents, social workers, nurses, interpreters, volunteers they could choose. And they enacted the role play, in the class. So this was pre-COVID-19. And they enacted things like an intake assessment session, and et cetera. And then the community-based portion of the course was related to a partnership I developed with the Alexandria Department of Community and Human Services, which is a social service agency, DCHS. So through that partnership, students had the opportunity to translate documents that their agency were lacking in Spanish. And those included an intake form, explanation of costs of services, treatment plans, and privacy practices. And then, of course, I integrated critical reflection throughout the course. Okay, next. Thank you. And then the final outcome of the course was linguistic landscape, as I've been talking about through this whole talk. So you can see the goal was to assess their critical language awareness, for learners to have an opportunity to demonstrate that by applying linguistic landscape methods in analyzing language use and social equity in public healthcare and social service settings. Of course, COVID-19 changed my original plan, and so I pivoted to a virtual format. And I kind of learned with my students along the way about what that actually meant in practice, for sure. So if you go to the next slide, please. So yeah, this was sort of the message alert, a message that I sent to my students. We will not be, in fact, be carrying out a linguistic landscape in the community, but we will still carry one out, albeit virtually. So I was not aware of any work that had been done about virtual linguistic landscape. This is one of the only studies I could find, which I think is the first study to use the term virtual linguistic landscape. So reading that kind of helped me conceptualize how I was going to go about this. But what I did was I structured the linguistic landscape project around 4 phases: an observation phase, an interpretation phase, critical analysis, and then critical analysis and reflection. And I'll take you through each of those steps before showing you some examples from their projects. Next slide, please. Thank you. So one key step before carrying out these now virtual linguistic landscapes was to do some research on local Spanish-speaking communities in the DC metro area, which encompasses Maryland and Northern Virginia, and Fairfax County, where our university is located. So, you know, this is an area with high linguistic and cultural diversity, has the 12th largest Latino population in the US, which constitutes 15.3% of the DC metro area's total population. And while there's a wide range of nationality backgrounds represented, it's the only one in the United States with a majority Salvadoran population, 33.3%. But you can also see there's a quite high percentage of people reporting other Latino origins, and within that group are Bolivian immigrants. So these numbers of diversity are also reflected in Fairfax County, where we have a 16%, where 16% of the population in Fairfax County report speaking Spanish at home. So along with this high diversity, Sang notes that there's also a high degree of socioeconomic inequality, particularly in terms of the division between, you know, more elite groups associated with government, international organizations and corporations on the one hand, and then on the other hand, less privileged local or ethnic groups. Next slide, please, Joseph. Thanks. Okay, and this was another key warm-up step. You know, it was important. It was, you know, my students didn't know what linguistic landscape was, and we were all learning sobre la marcha, so to speak. So a key step was to first analyze examples of the physical linguistic landscape in different regions of the US. And this prepared students to think about how they would, or how they might interpret the linguistic landscape data that they would collect in the virtual space. So these are just examples. I'll let you read some of the question prompts I included. Next slide, please. Okay, so the first phase was observation and data gathering. Students, you know, I provided examples of potential sites or organizations, local healthcare and social service organizations they could focus on. Many of them chose to focus on Fairfax County, services provided by Fairfax County. And, you know, I gave them ideas of different facets of the virtual linguistic landscape they could focus on. So their goal was to just simply observe and describe language use based on the main pages of the website, texts and descriptions, linked documents like PDFs, the search function, if there were any infographics or brochures, marketing materials, videos, social media accounts linked to the organization like Facebook and Twitter, and then to take notes during their observations and to take a minimum of, instead of using photography, we use screenshots. So that was pretty easily adaptable to the virtual space. Next one, please. And then in the critical analysis and reflection part, which also encompassed, the sort of these symbolic and informative functions of linguistic landscape that we saw at the beginning of the presentation. Also, I asked them, what does this reveal about the ethno-linguistic vitality? What are your observations reveal about the ethno-linguistic vitality of the local Spanish-speaking populations? And based on this, what conclusions can you draw about language and social equity in the public virtual sphere in these settings? And what do you think are the consequences? So there's sort of a series of 5 guiding questions that guided them in their write-up of their linguistic landscape, which included these visual screenshots that they gathered. Okay, next. Thank you. Great. Okay. So I'm just going to share a few examples. I wish I could share all of their projects because they were brilliant, of course. But I'll just share from 3 of my heritage students some insights from their projects. So this is Carla, which is a pseudonym. Carla was a biology major and a Spanish minor. And she chose to focus on Inova Fairfax Hospital. She was actually working at Inova Fairfax Hospital in the maternity and birthing center, I believe. And one of the key insights from her project was that when she noted almost every single person in the class noted the Google Translate function, and that all of the sites heavily relied on the Google, automatic translator to translate the entire site. And so that was one of her first observations. And then, as she dug deeper, she found that the search function was different, or it yielded different results based on whether you did the search in Spanish or did the search for information in English. So I don't know if you can see that, but in the English search, she put in childbirth and maternity services, and in the Spanish function, she put servicios de maternidad y parto. And what came out of the search was, in the Spanish version, was 1 result, and in English, 361 results came out. So thank you. So what Carla interpreted this as is, first, this demonstrates the limits of Google Translate. It can only be used superficially, and it doesn't work with the search function of the web page to efficiently show all of the possible results of the search. This puts minorities in the out group by excluding them from being able to access the same information that an English speaker has access to. Next slide, please. Thank you. And then Carla also focused on telemedicine visits because, of course, that is becoming more and more prevalent, especially in the context of the global pandemic. So she looked at instructions for making prenatal telemedicine visits. And what she found was that it was available in Spanish initially, but then when you clicked on the PDF document to access the actual instructions with the valuable information on it, she found it to be only available in English. And that led her to reflect on the fact that, Inova has language services that they say they provide freely, including interpretation and written information. But she said, upon analyzing the availability of PDF forms in Spanish, you can see that this is only the case if the patient is in the hospital physically. Because she has observed by working there that there are those documents available in Spanish, but they are not yet available in the virtual space. Next one, please. And, oh, sorry, can you go back, Joseph? Thank you. So, her takeaway from that was this demonstrates that the local Spanish-speaking community is constantly finding, this is an example of an obstacle in obtaining information that they're looking for. Go to the next one. And then finally, another example from Carla. This was really striking example, I think. She found that there was a lack of information about COVID-19 in Spanish, but not just information about how to make an appointment to get tested or about testing kits and whatnot, about symptoms. That information was available in Spanish. What was really strikingly absent in Spanish was information about how to help, how to donate money, time, volunteer. And can you show the quotes, Joseph? So she thought it was really striking how this sort of absence denies the Spanish-speaking community with the opportunity to help, to look for help, and to also offer help to the hospital in whatever capacity they may be willing to offer, right? So she says, por ejemplo, esta página en particular enumera cosas que un hablante de inglés puede hacer para ayudar y apoyar al hospital y a su personal. Por ejemplo, ellos pueden donar al fondo de preparación, donar suministros y comidas, solicitar un puesto temporal para ellos que son médicos registrados y tienen la oportunidad para participar en la investigación mediante la donación de plasma y de sangre. Y todas esas cosas cruciales que casi cualquier persona puede participar para ayudar en esta pandemia que afecta al mundo. So effectively, by not having this information in Spanish, it was a symbolic construction of the value of Spanish and of its speakers and how they were positioned in a way that did not allow them to help. It was exclusion. Okay, go to the next one. Okay, so in this case, Marisa was also at Pseudonym. She focused on the Fairfax County Health Department and specifically a program for women and children called WIC, the Women, Infants, and Children program. And again, she, like Carla, she also noticed that, wow, this heavy reliance on the Google Translate function. And also she really made a note of the warning that so once you hit Google Translate and you select the language, there was a warning that came up, we just want to let you know this conversion may not be fully accurate. The Fairfax County government cannot guarantee its accuracy. And then it goes on to say, basically, you're lucky this service is available at all because English is the official language of the Commonwealth of Virginia. And that these documents, the translation of these documents are being offered as a convenience to those who live and work in the county. So if there is a discrepancy between an English version of a document and a translated version, then the English version will take precedence. So can you show the quote? Thank you. And, Marisa critically reflected on sort of not only what the lexical errors that might and syntactic errors in terms of the automatic translation might render, but also what the message is that sends to the Spanish-speaking population. Okay, next. Marisa also noted the complete absence of social media accounts on Twitter and Facebook that were connected to the WIC program, La Página de WIC. They were only available in English. And so she kind of concludes, even though the visibility of Spanish is present it's not very effective or efficient. And this affects the Spanish-speaking community in terms of how they perceive themselves. So their self-perception and belonging. All right, next. Okay, and this is the last example. Teresa also looked at the Fairfax County Health and Human Services Department in her linguistic landscape. And what she noticed she really focused on the dichotomy between the professional translations that she found that were related to COVID-19 information versus the lack of effort and inconsistency that the automatic Google Translate function produced. So, and what that message sent to the viewers. Okay, can you show thank you. So she said, in the COVID-19 page, there are professional translations to ensure that the community is informed, but it's concerning that they use Google Translate for the rest of the site, in spite of it being not a very reliable resource or service. There's no way to correct or regulate the translations that can result in misunderstandings in important health-related cases, or even with sensitive information. And so she says it seems like it's just not necessary to them to make the effort to translate everything officially, in spite of there being such a large Spanish-speaking community in Fairfax. And, she used the word injusto, right? It seems also a little, parece injusto al tomar en cuenta de que es necesario entender al menos un poco de inglés solamente para poder navegar la página, para encontrar cómo se puede traducir. Okay, so awesome. I'm going to just end with a few takeaways from what I think and hope these examples have demonstrated. And this is, I think really interestingly similar and parallel to what Martinez found in his 2014 study. There was sort of this inconsistency and imbalance in access to information. Certain things were not available in Spanish, and that sort of constituted the absence and the exclusion of Spanish had an impact, right, on its viewers. And the PDFs were not available in Spanish, only English. The search results were very imbalanced, and this all impacted key information that someone might be looking for related to their health concerns. And then a key takeaway, I think, from these projects was that visibility does not always equal access to information. Even though Spanish was visible, many commented, well, it's encouraging that at least they recognize they need to try to provide information in Spanish. It didn't always translate well. The message sent was not always positive in terms of, using Google Translate. And then finally, there was Carla's observation about the high stakes and high status information was relayed only in English in terms of where can I donate money to help? How can I help and volunteer? Where can I donate plasma? That was only available in English. So if you'll show the next, thank you. So I think these linguistic landscapes demonstrate an informative and symbolic function that the virtual linguistic landscape exemplifies. It shows how it has an impact on the perceived value and sense of belonging that its viewers have. And it also points out that, especially in healthcare and social service context, the potential psychological and physical consequences related to health that a lack of access to information can have. Okay, last slide. So I'll just say, I think the linguistic landscape for me in this concept, on this context, really served me as an educator in terms of facilitating my language learning objectives in this course. I think it can foster a process of coming to critical consciousness. It enabled learners to sort of see language access through a critical lens. And I think it offers too a form of assessment of critical language awareness that provides a dynamic and dialogic assessment. And what I mean by that is that I didn't have any preset answers or ideas about what was going to emerge out of these linguistic landscape final project. It was a dynamic dialogic construction of knowledge, and that aligns with goals of critical language pedagogy. And I also think a key point is that in the case of my heritage speakers, especially, it provided them with the opportunity to develop and exert their agency, which I think in the sense of analyzing and reconstructing the Latino imaginary is really powerful. So what I mean by constructing is, in the case of Carla, for example, she shared her findings from her linguistic landscape with her employer, the Inova Fairfax Hospital. And so in terms of exerting her agency and changing potentially the linguistic landscape of that particular space, I think is powerful. Okay. And then, I have so many ideas. And I think that after, carrying this out in the context of my own course, but I do think linguistic landscape is a key method for heritage teacher education and training, especially when combined with multiliteracy approaches. I think it has a lot of potential. I also think there's definitely areas that have not been looked at through linguistic landscape methods, like the presence and visibility of gender inclusive language, either in the physical environment or the virtual one. And finally, I think the next time I do this, I want to, further enhance critical language awareness by incorporating multiple perspectives from different stakeholders via questionnaires and interviews, and their perspectives of the linguistic landscape. So with that, I am going to stop speaking. Thank you so much for your time.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yes, I welcome questions, and I have not been looking at the chat, so.
Thank you so much, Ellen, for this really informative, illustrative, and really valuable talk. I think it's of interest not just to language teaching, but to linguistics, to translation studies, to psychology, I would say, wouldn't you, Maria Luisa? I think it relates to many different fields of knowledge. So thank you so much. There's one question already by Ana Maria Lopez Jimeno, and she congratulates you on saying it's a really interesting talk. I would like to know, she says, what was the level of Spanish of the 13 students that followed your course?
Sure. Thank you, Ana Maria Lopez, for your question. That it was advanced. I mean, there's always variability, but it was a 400 level course, which is the highest level in terms of our course sequencing in our Spanish major. So, they had already taken 100, 200, 300 level courses. So yes, this was advanced.
Mm-hmm. Okay, this Nayeli Castro, she wants to ask something.
Yes, I do. Thank you so much. Muchísimas gracias. Aprendí mucho. Voy a confesar con un poco de pena que es la primera vez que oía el término de linguistic landscape, pero estoy fascinada. I am really, really very excited.
Awesome.
I have a question about Marisa's examples when she noted that in one of her I think it was a website, some translations were done professionally, whereas of course versus the other one who were automated by Google. How did she, it takes some competence in translation to figure out these things. So I wanted to ask, how did she find out? If she dug a little bit more to see who were the professional translators doing this and why
Yeah.
had been hired. Yes.
Thank you, Nayeli. That's a great question. To be honest, I think that was her impression. I did not go on the website to confirm, that this was done by a professional translator. I think that was her impression though, because of the way the way she was able to access it. She didn't have to first press the Google Translate button to access it in Spanish. And so, this was right after COVID-19 hit. And so I think that the Fairfax County Health and Human Services Department, prominently centered the information and made it available via, I guess a more professionally translated service. So I think that was her conclusion based on how it was able to be accessed, that she didn't have to go first through the Google Translate function, but that's a good point.
Thank you so much.
Mhm.
You.
I have a question myself while other people start sending their questions. This is actually a question that both Joseph and I had when we were preparing the flyer. And it's probably a beginner's question, so please excuse my ignorance. And it is whether the concept of linguistic landscape includes oral messages or just visual messages, because there are so many messages in bilingual discourse in public spaces like airports, railway stations,
Yeah.
or even through the telephone, through the phone, where you get these messages from telephone companies or from the government. So I wonder whether you somehow whether the concept includes these oral messages, or they are completely discarded.
That is not a beginner question, Marta. Thank you. That's a really great question. And actually, from what I do not claim to be an expert in linguistic landscape. I'm learning as I go and reading. But I do know that I think people like Ilana Shohami, who is in Israel, has done a lot of work out of Israel on this topic, has really advocated for an expanded concept of linguistic landscape that includes everything, right? And that would include oral messages. And so in this case, I included that they could have analyzed videos or any sort of oral message that was embedded into the website. So I think that, yeah, that's a great question. I think where linguistic landscape started, it was definitely physical, visual, what you can see, based on Landry and Borges' work, but that's evolved over time.
Yeah, because actually when you showed us a definition of linguistic landscape as the site of contested space and something, but this wouldn't contradict the definition of it as space, because after all, oral messages occupy our space, our being in a particular location, don't they?
Yes.
In a way.
Yes.
So there wouldn't be a contradiction in it.
Not at all. Yeah, that's a great point.
Thank you. Anyway, so now we've got another question by Nadine O'Malley. This is a very interesting discussion, she says, and her question is, in cases where it is stipulated that there are certain things that supposedly cannot be translated accurately, what can be the workaround for this so that information can be more accessible or more inclusive when things cannot be translated accurately?
So Nadine, thank you for your question. I'm trying to figure out exactly, do you mean, certain cultural sayings or things that can't be directly translated, or in what sense?
Hi, yeah.
Hi, Nadine.
I was thinking about that example in the WIC website where they said, the site claims that the translations cannot be done accurately. And so, the English will take precedence. So, I know there are probably other cases, such as that one. So maybe thinking about the difficulties of translating certain things, maybe legal matters, for example, into another language. So what is, maybe in your experience, what is usually the way to make it more inclusive or more accessible to people who may not have that as their primary language?
I'm going to be honest and say I don't know. But I will think about that. I mean, that's a great question. Because I will have to think about that.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, it's okay. It was just something that caught me attention. Like, maybe for example, like medical terms. So yeah, that was just an interesting point for me that sort of caught my attention.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
Marta and Ellen, if I may add something to that question, some of the students that take my course in the community volunteer at legal clinics, and that is one of the major challenges they face because, well, first of all, they are not necessarily lawyers, but even when you are a lawyer, there's so much difference, sometimes cultural differences, and some terminology not necessarily is going to match the legal circumstances, even when you translate it in Google, right? So I think that this area of translation is just, we think about it in a literary terms, maybe, but the scope of the work and the impact in these settings, legal, medical, educational, it's really powerful. And there's so much to be done there. If I can take another minute, Ellen, I think that, a main contribution for your work, even if you are learning as you go with it, is that you are pushing the limits of what our Spanish classes should aim for and what are their goals. And what I find really important here is that you're saying it's not just about, grammar or description or aesthetics with the language. It's about, how to, as you say, bring awareness in the students and in all of us as teachers to enable those opportunities to work in the community and to impact also the community. I think that it was fascinating that the student that took your class talked to the people in her workplace about this. And all these layers that are so, we know that there's issues of access, but then you take this, or your work or students' work show us that it's another step further is access in person and online. And in every instance, the access gets reduced. And I think that this project is really important for that reason. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Maria Luisa, so much for your words. I also wanted to note that all of my heritage speakers in the course had served, almost all of them had served as language brokers during childhood or adolescence for a family member or a loved one in a medical setting. And so that's what one of the critical reflections was their own language brokering experiences. What I hope to do next time is in the linguistic landscape is better incorporate, questions that prompt critical reflection about their own experiences through what they find through this methodology of linguistic landscape, and making sense more of that being positioned as a child, as a language interpreter for your family, and what that means psychologically, and how and making sense also of the broader connection between the system and the individual. And that's something that we really, in our Spanish courses that have a critical orientation, that we try to reveal or help learners realize, is that, Spanish speakers are so often positioned in terms of a deficit or being deficient and not speaking English. And so that is what causes these unequal outcomes. But really, it's leading them to realize it's actually a failure of the system, not the individual. So that's next time I want to make that a more prevalent focus of the linguistic landscape.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question from Joseph.
Hi, Joseph.
Hi,
Hi,
Joseph.
thank you so much for this lovely presentation. My question, so a lot of the disparity that we see with linguistic landscape kind of contribute to like implicit bias as opposed to explicit bias, but it seemed like the case of the Wick translation that there was, you said that like people should be grateful almost that these translations, or the site indicated that people should almost be grateful for these translations. And so I'm curious, in the case of the ANOVA person and the person who spoke with their boss about the disparity, when they made the person aware of the explicit bias, was there, like, do you know what the response was?
Thank you for asking that question. And I do not. I have been in contact with Carla because I wanted to feature her work in a national newsletter that's linked to the National Symposium on Spanish as a Heritage Language that I think now Claudia Holguin is in charge of creating and publishing once or twice a year. So they were featuring stories of heritage student work. And so I was in contact with her about asking permission to share with the newsletter. But now that I was doing this presentation, I realized I never knew what was the outcome of her efforts to communicate her findings with their employer and if there was any observed change. So I will do that now. Thank you. Thank you. That's a really good question.
Yeah, I would also like to like Maria Luisa, congratulate you on the use of this and the really interesting and valuable use of this tool for language learning, because as you were showing us some examples, not just of your students, but of the photos, the pictures that you showed at the beginning, there was one that prompted some reflection to me. Like there was one which was, please do not, let's say typical English prohibition, please do not do whatever. I can't remember what the content is, and the Spanish was, por favor se prohíbe. And that immediately made me think, in Spanish, at least in Spain, that would sound very, very peculiar even, or unnatural, because you don't prohibit by asking please, no prohíbes por favor. Si prohíbes, prohíbes. Se acabó.
Exacto. Y eso refleja la norma cultural. Yeah.
That's it. So here we have an example of translanguaging, or I don't know if you would call it translanguaging or language interference. And since the English has please, but in Spanish you forbid by saying prohibido, something, or se prohíbe, but you don't want to sound impolite, or maybe just simply by language interference, they transfer the please.
Right.
Well, I thought that maybe these examples, this tool does not only is not only useful to analyze the social, the cultural, political value, but also linguistic features, and maybe even how norms may be changing, or how discourses may be different depending on the context. Since we're in a multilinguistic context, por favor se prohíbe might eventually become normal, I mean, habitual, whereas in a more monolingual Spanish context, it would still be, frowned upon a little bit, or maybe just found a bit peculiar.
Sonaría
raro.
So I think what you're saying is exactly right. I think it can be a reflection of the linguistic context, especially in cases of contact. And I think that sign was in San Antonio, Texas, which is, a context where English and Spanish have been in contact for, over 400 years. And so that might be the norm. That might be the norm in terms of the contact variety spoken there, or maybe it reflects more of a Mexican Spanish norm. But Yeah, I mean, there's really so much that you can analyze through this method, and I just must say that I have been so inspired by my colleagues, especially Dr. Jennifer Lehman and Dr. Maria Luisa Parra right here with us in the use of critical language teaching methods and what that actually means in practice. And so this work is a reflection of that.
Would anybody like to ask another question or make some comment?
Thank you for all the nice words in the chat. I really appreciate it.
We'll send you the chat later.
Oh, thank you. So grateful all of you could be here.
Yeah. No other questions? Maria Luisa, would you like to make any?
Yeah, no, I just want to, I already put it on the chat, but I'm going to put it again.
Yes.
Ellen, it's a part of this very important initiative at George Mason University. It's a certificate of Spanish heritage language education. And the director is Dr. Jennifer Lehman, that is here with us. So I'm putting information because they have an online lecture series. I think in March is the last one, and they're going to have an open house. And I think that it's a great opportunity to learn more about this program, and where we all can keep learning about these very important findings, methodologies, perspectives. I think that the critical perspective has to become more and more prevalent in our language classes. So thank you.
Thank you for sharing that, those two programs at George Mason. And I also, Maria Luisa, I also wanted to share, here's the open house information. March 10th, we'll be having a virtual open house about our Spanish programs, master's programs, and then also our Spanish Heritage Language Education graduate certificate, which can be completed fully online. So thank you for sharing that.
I think there's I think Marcela Fritzler would like to make a comment. Have I interpreted that correctly, Marcela? Because you wrote something saying there was a comment.
Hola.
Sí.
Hola.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
Hola.
Hola.
Hola. ¿Puedo preguntar en español?
Sí, adelante.
Perdón, porque es muy tarde aquí. Nosotros tenemos preparación de muchos estudiantes médicos. El tema de la medicina que comentaban, los problemas de traducciones y demás, muchos estudiantes que preparamos médicos como para poder dar respuesta a cierta falencia que dicen que tienen en la comunidad. ¿Se ve, lo sienten ustedes la participación de esa forma? Digamos que hay una preocupación de preparar profesionales para suplantar el tema de las plataformas, por ejemplo, que no tienen suficiente traducción.
Sí, o sea, de esa necesidad nació la iniciativa de la que estaba hablando, de la beca Curriculum Impact Grant, porque veíamos, o sea, mis colegas que trabajaban o que todavía trabajan en diferentes facultades, en la de la enfermería, en la salud y en los servicios sociales, notaban que no hay ningún espacio curricular en el currículum para sus estudiantes para tomar clases avanzadas del español, para tomar clases del español para fines específicos, clases como la mía, Spanish for Social Services, y además reconocían que había una gran población de hablantes de español como lengua de herencia. Entonces, ellos no tenían la oportunidad de avanzar en su competencia y de desarrollar su competencia profesional en la lengua para utilizar en el ámbito médico. Entonces, sí, es un gran hueco, un gran vacío en cuanto al currículo en la preparación de los estudiantes. No sé si he contestado su pregunta o no.
Ellen, para que estén un poco también más acompañados. Hoy precisamente hemos sufrido en forma directa el tema porque a pesar de Israel ser un país de inmigrantes y solo formado por inmigrantes, existe a todo lo que es a nivel de plataformas gubernamentales una falencia, un hueco enorme a los que no pueden hablar hebreo. Y más todavía también a los que no pueden hablar incluso árabe, siendo la lengua oficial. Así que para que se sientan acompañados, los estamos viviendo en forma directa desde otra geografía esta situación. Gracias.
Wow, gracias por compartir su
Gracias por
experiencia y gracias por estar aquí.
Sí, desde Israel.
Ya, wow.
Muchas gracias. Un gusto.
Gracias, Marcela.
Bueno, no sé si ya quieres cerrar tú el evento, María Luisa. Agradecemos muchísimo a Ellen.
Claro que sí.
Con
claro
un gran
que sí.
aplauso.
Un aplauso virtual. Esperemos dártelo en persona en algún momento y muchísimas gracias a toda la audiencia por habernos acompañado. Creo que todos aprendimos muchísimo, un trabajo muy importante, muy relevante en todo el mundo, por lo que nos comparte Marcela. Así que esperemos que esto informe también nuestra enseñanza y nuestras prácticas. Mil gracias, Ellen. Gracias, Marta, por el apoyo del observatorio, Victoria y Joseph por su apoyo en la logística del evento. Siempre impecable.
La próxima vez en Boston.
Ojalá.
Sí,
ojalá. Muchísimas gracias, Ellen. Ha sido magnífica. Y gracias, María Luisa, como siempre. Y a todos.
Fue un placer.
Gracias.
Fue un placer. Gracias.
Adiós.
Bye.